Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The flames devoured the night, a ravenous beast of orange and red consuming the dry timber of the cookhouse and spitting furious embers into the swirling snow. It was a hellish beacon against the vast, frozen emptiness of the Montana plains. Through this inferno, a figure emerged, broad-shouldered and resolute, shielding a smaller form held tight against his chest. Silas Blackwood did not feel the searing heat that licked at his worn coat or the sting of smoke in his lungs. His entire world had been forged into a single point of focus, the still, soot-stained face of Eliza Vance. He had watched her for weeks, a ghost in his own home, haunted by the memory of his silence years ago in a gilded saloon. Now, as he carried her away from the blaze, his back to the flames, each step was a penance, an unspoken vow to never be that coward again. Across the chaotic ranch yard, half hidden by the shadows of the water trough, another man watched. Jedediah Grimes felt no alarm, only a cold, reptilian satisfaction. The fire was his handiwork, a simple message to the woman who didn't belong. But he was merely the lit match. The true architect of this destruction was miles away, a man of wealth and patience, whose ancient hatred for the name Blackwood was far more dangerous than any fire Jed could ever set. Would this trial by fire forge a bond strong enough to withstand the coming storm, or was it merely the first gust of a tempest designed to burn Stone River Ranch to the ground? The answer lay hidden in the falling snow, as silent and as unforgiving as the past itself. Stay with us as the story unfolds, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales where every sunrise is a battle and every heartbeat is a victory. Part 1. A Stranger in the Snow. Sevens. The wind howled across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Montana plains, a merciless predator chasing the last vestiges of daylight from the sky. It carried snow not in gentle flakes, but in sharp, stinging clouds that blurred the line between earth and firmament, turning the world into a churning vortex of white and gray. It was into this maelstrom that Eliza Vance walked, a solitary figure against the immense and indifferent landscape. Her coat, a threadbare relic of a kinder season, was patched at the elbows and offered little defense against the cold that sank its teeth deep into her bones. Her gloves were mismatched, one wool and one worn leather, and the satchel slung over her shoulder held all she owned in the world. Yet, she moved with a purpose that defied the storm, her spine held as straight as a rifle barrel, her chin lifted against the gale. Her boots, thin and cracked, left sharp, determined prints in the frozen mud of the Stone River Ranch yard, each step an act of defiance against the despair that nipped at her heels. She stopped before the largest of the outbuildings, a long, low structure from which the faint glow of a fire and the low murmur of male voices emanated. A group of cowboys were huddled near the open doors of a smithy, passing a flask and sharing crude laughter that was quickly snatched away by the wind. They fell silent as she approached, their laughter dying one by one as they took in the improbable sight of her. A woman, alone, stepping out of a blizzard in a place that gave nothing easily and took everything it could. One man, older than the rest, detached himself from the group. He was built like an old oak, gnarled and unyielding, with a thick gray beard and eyes the color of a winter sky. This was Thaddeus Blackwood, the patriarch of Stone River, and his face was a mask of ingrained suspicion. His voice, when he spoke, was like gravel grinding against stone. "This is a working ranch, miss. Not a sanctuary for strays or sob stories. State your business or be on your way." Eliza met his hard gaze without flinching, her own eyes burning with a fierce light that had been forged in fires he couldn't imagine. "I am not a stray," she replied, her voice low but steady, refusing to be carried off by the wind. "And I have no stories to sell." Another man, younger and leaner, with a perpetually cruel twist to his lips, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet. This was Jedediah Grimes. "Looks like she wandered out of a saloon kitchen, if not the back room," he sneered, drawing a ripple of harsh chuckles from the others. Thaddeus raised a hand, silencing them with a single gesture, though his eyes never left Eliza's face. He stepped closer, his sheer size an act of intimidation. "Then what do you want?" "We've no use for trouble." Eliza's jaw set, a hard line in her pale face. "I can cook," she said, each word as sharp and clean as flint. "I've worked cast iron over open flames, skinned game in a freezing creek, made sourdough in a snowstorm, and soup from little more than bone and grit. I can feed your men with whatever's left in the barrel and make 'em grateful for it." There was a pregnant pause, broken only by the roar of the wind and the crackle of the smithy's fire. Thaddeus studied her, his gaze sweeping over her worn clothes, her chapped hands, and landing again on those defiant eyes. "Where you from?" he demanded. Eliza's gaze didn't waver, but she offered no answer. "This ain't a place for secrets, girl," he growled. She lifted her chin a fraction higher. "I know how to work, and I'm not turning back." For a long moment, the old man and the young woman stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, with a gruff sigh that plumed in the frigid air, Thaddeus stepped aside. He jerked his head toward a dark, silent building at the edge of the yard. "The cookhouse. Last cook got drunk and rode off 3 days ago. We've got 36 men to see through this winter. Stove's in there. You want the job, you prove it. I want hot coffee and biscuits that don't break a man's teeth on my table by sunrise." Eliza gave a single, sharp nod. "I'll need flour, salt pork, coffee beans, and a dry towel. And a little respect wouldn't kill any of you." Thaddeus let out a sound that was half grunt, half laugh. "You'll get the flour. The respect you'll have to earn." As Eliza turned toward the cookhouse, her eyes swept over the silent group of men one last time. Most looked away, some smirked, but one man stood apart from the rest, leaning against a support beam in the shadows. He was tall, dressed in a dark, heavy coat, his hat pulled low, obscuring his face. He hadn't laughed or scoffed with the others. He had simply watched, his arms crossed over his chest, a statue of stillness amidst the swirling snow. For a heartbeat, her gaze met his, or at least the dark shadow where his eyes should be. She felt a flicker of something unreadable, a strange and unsettling resonance, before she turned and pushed open the heavy cookhouse door. The cold inside was even more profound than the wind, a dead, stagnant cold that smelled of stale grease and despair. Rusted pots hung from hooks like skeletons, and empty tins lay scattered on the floor. But in the corner, the great cast-iron stove stood like a dark altar, solid and promising. A stubborn flicker of hope ignited in Eliza's chest. This she could work with. She dropped her satchel, rolled up her sleeves, and set about the monumental task of bringing life back to the dead heart of the ranch. Outside, Silas Blackwood remained in the shadows long after the others had dispersed. He watched the faint light bloom in the cookhouse window as Eliza coaxed a flame to life. He had recognized her the moment she stepped out of the snow, a ghost from a past he tried daily to forget. He saw her not as a stranger, but as the woman from the Rosebell in Billings, the one with the spine of iron and eyes full of fire, the one he had failed with his silence. He felt the old shame, a bitter, familiar taste in his mouth. He clenched his fists inside his coat pockets, the guilt a physical weight in his gut. He said nothing, did nothing. He just watched the light in the window, a fragile beacon against the overwhelming dark. Later that evening, an old cowboy with a beard as white as the snow and a face like a weathered map approached the cookhouse. It was Grizzly Sam. He didn't knock, just left a bucket of semi-clean water and a small stack of dry kindling by the door before shuffling away without a word. It was the first and only act of kindness Eliza had received, a silent acknowledgement that she was not entirely alone. By dawn, the cookhouse was transformed. The scent of strong, black coffee and frying salt pork cut through the cold morning air, a clarion call more effective than any bell. The Cowboys filed in, sullen and suspicious, and found the long tables scrubbed clean and plates of hot, fluffy biscuits waiting for them. They ate in a gruff, appreciative silence, scraping their plates clean and passing the coffee pot until it was empty. No one offered a word of praise, but their empty plates were thanks enough. Thaddeus Blackwood himself entered, took a biscuit, broke it in half, and chewed thoughtfully. He looked at Eliza, who was busy at the stove, her back to the room, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before leaving. Eliza had won the first round. The days that followed fell into a grueling routine. Eliza rose before the moon had surrendered the sky and worked until long after the sun had set. She cooked, cleaned, and managed her meager supplies with a quiet efficiency that slowly chipped away at the men's hostility, replacing it with a grudging respect. She learned their habits. Who took their coffee black, who liked extra gravy, who had a sweet tooth. She was a constant, silent presence, always working, her face a mask of detached professionalism. She kept to herself, building a wall of solitude around her small domain. Silas continued to watch her from afar. He was always the first to arrive for breakfast, his eyes noting the weariness in her shoulders, the raw redness of her hands from the harsh lye soap. He never spoke to her, never met her gaze for more than a fleeting second, but his presence was a constant, silent orbit. One afternoon, he saw her struggling to split a pile of frozen pine wood, the axe heavy and awkward in her hands. She fought with a stubborn log for nearly an hour, her breath coming in ragged plumes, her small frame straining with the effort, until she finally gave up in exhausted frustration, leaving the woodpile in disarray. Silas's jaw tightened as he watched from the barn, the urge to go to her, to take the axe from her hands, warring with the shame that kept him rooted to the spot. The next morning, when Eliza opened her door to face the biting cold, she stopped dead. Stacked neatly against the wall, protected from the new fallen snow, was a large pile of perfectly split kindling and firewood, enough to last her for days. There was no one in sight. The yard was a pristine blanket of white, the only tracks leading from the bunkhouse to the barn. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the anonymous gift. It was a simple offering of wood, yet it felt like something more. In a world that had offered her nothing but hardship, it was a small, inexplicable act of grace. A flicker of warmth, unrelated to the fire she was about to build, touched her heart as she looked out across the silent, snow-covered ranch, wondering who had seen her struggle and chosen not to look away. Part 2. Whispers of the Rosebell. 7s. The small pile of firewood by the door became a quiet ritual. Every few mornings, Eliza would awaken to find it replenished, a silent testament to a hidden guardian. This anonymous kindness was a small anchor in the turbulent sea of her new life, a fragile warmth she held close in the face of the Cowboys' gruff indifference. Though they now ate her food with a near-religious devotion, their respect was a brittle thing, born of necessity rather than acceptance. They kept their distance, their conversations halting whenever she drew near, their eyes still holding a flicker of suspicion. Only Grizzly Sam ever offered a friendly word, his gruff compliments about her coffee or stew delivered like rare, precious nuggets of gold. But there was one man whose animosity seemed to fester and grow with each passing day. Jedediah Grimes. He watched her with a venomous intensity, his eyes narrowed in a way that suggested not just dislike, but a hateful sort of recognition. The turning point came during a rare lull in the winter storms, when a supply wagon from Billings finally made it through the pass. The arrival of mail and goods brought a near-festive atmosphere to the ranch, and that evening, the bunkhouse was filled with boisterous talk of the world beyond their snowbound existence. Jed, emboldened by a belly full of whiskey from a newly opened bottle, waited until the men were gathered around the stove before he played his card. He leaned back, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "You know," he began, his voice loud enough to carry, "I've been trying to place our new cook. Something familiar about her." He paused for dramatic effect, ensuring he had everyone's attention. "Took me a while, but I got it now. The Rosebell, off Main Street in Billings." The name fell into the room like a chunk of ice, instantly chilling the warm atmosphere. Every man there, whether they admitted it or not, knew of the Rosebell. It was a saloon draped in cheap velvet and cheaper morals, a place where men went to forget their names and women went to sell theirs. She wore an apron then, too, Jed continued, savoring his moment. Always smelled of sage and wood smoke. Real quiet, that one. Said she was the cook, sure. But we all know how those places work. Girls get pulled upstairs once the whiskey flows, and the pay is good. A few men chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. No one defended her. The seed of poison had been planted, and in the fertile ground of boredom and suspicion, it took root immediately. Eliza didn't hear it that night, but she felt it the next morning. The air in the cookhouse was different, thick with a new kind of silence. The usual clatter of forks and knives was muted. Men who had started to nod a curt "good morning" now stared fixedly at their plates. They filed in, took their food, and left without a word. Their politeness was now a weapon, a cold, sharp barrier that isolated her more effectively than any insult. She knew that look. She had seen it 100 times before, the sideways glances, the lowered voices, the way decent men could turn into judges, jury, and executioners once they thought they knew a single, ugly piece of a woman's story. Her shoulders, which had begun to relax, stiffened once more. The small, tentative smiles she had sometimes allowed herself vanished completely. She worked with the same rhythmic efficiency, her hands never faltering as she stirred the beans or sliced the bacon, but the wall around her rose again, higher and thicker than before. What could she say? Denying it would only make her seem guiltier. Explaining the nuance that she had cooked in their kitchen but never sold herself in their rooms was a waste of breath. To men like these, A woman touched by scandal was tainted to the core. So she said nothing. She endured. She had survived worse. Silas had heard it all. He had been sitting in the corner of the bunkhouse, mending a bridle, when Jed started talking. Every word had been like a hammer blow against the anvil of his guilt. He didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He had simply gone still, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather strap, the memory of that night at the Rosebell roaring back to life, her defiant eyes, the cruel laughter, his own cowardly inaction. The shame was so profound it was suffocating. The next day, he watched as the other men shunned her, their silent judgment a palpable force in the room. He saw the light in her eyes dim, the proud set of her shoulders slump ever so slightly, and he saw Jed Grimes preening, enjoying the cruelty he had unleashed. The breaking point came that afternoon. Eliza was hauling 2 heavy buckets of water across the icy yard when Jed deliberately stepped into her path. "Careful there, Rosie," he sneered, using a common name for saloon girls. "Wouldn't want you to spill. Might stain that pristine reputation you've got." Eliza stopped, her expression unreadable. She simply adjusted her grip and tried to step around him. But Jed shifted, blocking her again. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or you just saving your sweet talk for customers who pay?" Before another word could be spoken, a blur of motion exploded from the side. Silas had crossed the 10 yards from the barn in a flash of silent fury. There was no warning, no shouted challenge, just the hard, wet crack of a fist connecting with a jaw. Jed hit the frozen ground with a grunt, spitting blood and curses. "What the hell is wrong with you, Blackwood?" He sputtered, holding his face. Silas stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched, a dangerous fire burning in his eyes. The yard had gone deathly quiet. Every cowboy within sight had frozen, watching the tableau. Silas stared down at Jed for one more terrifying second. Then, without a word, he turned and stalked back towards the barn, his shoulders rigid with a rage that had been simmering for years. He never once looked at Eliza. He hadn't spoken a single word in her defense. He had only offered violence, a raw, masculine act that protected her body but did nothing to shield her name. Eliza stood frozen, the water buckets heavy in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched Silas disappear into the shadows of the barn, a whirlwind of confusion and shock tearing through her. Why? Why would this silent, watchful man, who had never spoken to her, resort to such brutality on her behalf? Was it pity? A guilty conscience? Or something else entirely? His violence had saved her from Jed's harassment, but it had also placed her at the very center of a conflict she didn't understand. The punch had shattered the ranch's fragile peace, drawing a line in the snow between Silas and the other men. And it had left Eliza standing squarely in the middle, more exposed and more alone than ever before, with no answers, only the echoing crack of the blow and the silent retreat of her strange, violent protector. That night, she found the usual pile of firewood by her door, but this time it was accompanied by a small, burlap sack. Inside was a handful of dried apples, a rare and expensive treat. The gesture was meant to be kind, she knew, but it only deepened the mystery. He would fight for her, provide for her in secret, but he would not, or could not, speak to her. As she held a piece of the sweet, wrinkled fruit in her hand, she wondered what demons lived behind the eyes of Silas Blackwood, and why they seemed so determined to make her their business. Part 3. The Line Drawn in Dust. Sevens. Silas's punch echoed through the ranch for days, creating a schism in the social fabric of the bunkhouse. The men were now divided. A few, like Grizzly Sam, looked at Silas with a newfound, quiet respect, while the majority, led by a still bruised and resentful Jed Grimes, treated him with a cold hostility. Silas was now an outsider in his own home, his act of violence having branded him as something other, something unpredictable. For Eliza, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. She was the unwilling epicenter of the turmoil, the fuse that had ignited the ranch's simmering tensions. The men's avoidance was now laced with fear and resentment, as if she were a harbinger of chaos. She retreated further into herself, her world shrinking to the four walls of the cookhouse, finding solace only in the familiar rhythms of kneading dough and stirring pots. She and Silas existed in a state of charged silence, their paths crossing in the cold pre-dawn hours without a single word exchanged. Yet, an invisible thread now connected them. His secret acts of kindness continued, a mended hinge on the woodshed, a new, sharp knife left on her cutting board, but they were now colored by the memory of his public fury. He was a paradox she couldn't solve. A man of gentle gestures and brutal force, of profound silence and explosive action. She didn't know whether to fear him or trust him, and so she did neither, simply watching him with the same cautious curiosity she would a wild, untamed animal. The fragile, fractured peace was shattered by the arrival of a sleek, black buggy pulled by two magnificent bays, an apparition of wealth and sophistication against the rustic backdrop of Stone River. Out of it stepped a man who seemed entirely out of place in the rugged landscape. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his silver-tipped cane tapped against the frozen ground with an air of arrogant authority. This was Bartholomew Thorne, and his smile, though charming on the surface, did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Thaddeus Blackwood greeted him on the porch of the main house with a stiff formality that hinted at a tense and storied history. "Thorne," Thaddeus grunted, his voice laced with a reluctant civility. "You made good time." Thorne's smile widened. "I always do, Blackwood. Punctuality, like vengeance, is a virtue best served promptly." The two men disappeared into the main house, their meeting casting a palpable shadow over the entire ranch. The Cowboys whispered amongst themselves. Everyone knew that Thorne was a shrewd and ruthless businessman from the East who had been buying up land and water rights all over the territory, squeezing smaller ranchers into bankruptcy. His presence at Stone River felt like a vulture circling a weakened animal. Later that day, as Eliza served the midday meal, the door to the cookhouse opened, and Thaddeus Blackwood entered, followed by his distinguished guest. A hush fell over the room. Thorne's gaze swept across the rough-hewn tables and the silent cowboys, a look of faint amusement on his face. And then, his eyes landed on Eliza. A flicker of genuine surprise, followed by a slow, predatory smile of recognition, transformed his features. He stopped, his head tilted. "Well, well," he purred, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "What an unexpected reunion." He took a step toward her, deliberately ignoring Thaddeus's darkening expression. "I remember you. The little kitchen mouse from the Rose Bell. Such a fiery spirit in such a drab little package." He turned to Thaddeus, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "My dear Blackwood, times must be harder than I thought if you're hiring your help from the dregs of Billings." The insult was a physical blow. Every man in the room froze, their forks halfway to their mouths. Jed Grimes smirked openly, relishing her humiliation. Eliza stood ramrod straight, the heavy ladle still in her hand, her face a pale, emotionless mask, though her knuckles were white. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But Silas, who had been sitting in the far corner, rose slowly to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. His face was a thundercloud of controlled rage, his eyes locked on Thorne. Thaddeus shot his son a warning glare, a silent command to stand down. Reputation was everything to Thaddeus, and Thorne had just expertly weaponized Eliza's past to tarnish the name of Stone River. Later, the inevitable confrontation erupted in the main house. Through the thick walls, the ranch hands could hear the raised, angry voice of their boss. The summons came for Silas just as dusk was settling. He found his father pacing in front of a roaring fire, his face etched with fury. Thorne was gone, having delivered his poison and departed. "She has made a mockery of this ranch," Thaddeus roared, not even looking at his son. Thorne was laughing at me, at our name. A saloon girl serving my men. Do you have any idea the damage this does? "She's a cook," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "A good one. Her past is her own. Her past is now our problem." Thaddeus slammed his fist on the great oak mantelpiece. "I will not have the Blackwood name dragged through the mud because of you and some strumpet you've taken a liking to. I want her gone. Gone by sunrise. That is an order." Silas stood his ground, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his determined face. "No." The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. Thaddeus stopped pacing and turned slowly to face his son, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What did you say to me?" "I said no," Silas repeated, his voice stronger now, imbued with a conviction that had been absent his entire life. "She has done nothing wrong. She works harder than any man here, and she's been judged and humiliated for things that are no one's business. She has nowhere else to go. She stays." Thaddeus's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He took a menacing step toward Silas, his powerful frame radiating fury. "You would defy me? For her?" For a moment, the old, ingrained instinct to obey, to bow to his father's will, flickered in Silas's eyes. He had spent a lifetime in this man's shadow, seeking an approval that was never given. But then, the image of Eliza's face, so pale and proud as Thorne insulted her, flashed in his mind. He thought of her quiet dignity, her resilience, and his own years of silent shame. This was his chance, not just to save her, but to save himself. He drew himself up to his full height, meeting his father's gaze without flinching. This was more than a disagreement. It was a line being drawn in the dust of their shared history. "She is a good woman, and she is under my protection," Silas declared, his voice ringing with finality. "If she goes, I go with her." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, thick and unbreakable. For the first time in his life, Silas Blackwood was no longer a passive observer, no longer a boy haunted by his past inaction. He was a man making a stand, choosing his own code of honor over his father's rigid pride. He had chosen his side, and in doing so, had declared war not only on Bartholomew Thorne, but on his own father as well. Part 4. From the Ashes, A Vow. Sevens. The aftermath of Silas's defiance was a cold, suffocating silence that fell over the entire ranch. Thaddeus Blackwood did not rage or yell further. Instead, he treated his son with an icy disdain that was far more brutal. He looked through Silas as if he were a ghost, issuing orders to other men when Silas was standing right beside him and pointedly ignoring his presence at the dinner table. Silas was an exile in his own home, the weight of his father's disapproval a heavy cloak on his shoulders. The other cowboys, sensing the shift in power, followed their boss's lead. They gave Silas a wide berth, their interactions clipped and formal, leaving him isolated with only Grizzly Sam for occasional, quiet company. For Eliza, the situation was untenable. She was the reason for the chasm that had ripped the Blackwood family apart, and she felt the weight of that responsibility with every hostile glare and whispered comment. Yet, amidst the tension, a strange new dynamic formed between her and Silas. His protection was no longer a secret. It was a bold, public declaration, and it changed everything. He now met her gaze across the cold yard, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He took to chopping all her firewood himself, no longer under the cover of darkness, but in the broad, challenging light of day. He would walk with her when she went to the well, not speaking, but his presence a clear warning to Jed Grimes and his cronies. They were two solitary islands, now bound by a shared enemy and an unspoken alliance. Bartholomew Thorne, having sown the seeds of discord, was content to watch them grow from a distance. From his comfortable suite in Billings, he received regular reports from his man on the inside. Jed Grimes, fueled by his hatred for both Silas and Eliza and emboldened by Thorne's coin, escalated his campaign of petty sabotage. A harness would mysteriously break, a fence would be cut, allowing a handful of cattle to wander off into the snow. They were small, irritating acts designed to fray nerves and disrupt the ranch's operations, making Thaddeus even more resentful of the distraction his son had brought upon them. The final, brutal stroke came on a moonless, bitterly cold night. The wind had picked up again, shrieking through the outbuildings like a banshee. Eliza, exhausted from the long day and the even longer weeks of emotional strain, had finally fallen into a restless sleep on the small cot in the corner of the cookhouse. She didn't hear the stealthy footsteps outside, nor the soft splash of kerosene against the rear wall. She didn't see the flicker of the match or the whoosh of the initial ignition. What woke her was the roar. She sat bolt upright, her heart seizing with terror, to a world transformed into a living nightmare. The back wall of the cookhouse was a solid sheet of orange flame, devouring the dry timber with a hungry, crackling roar. Thick, black smoke poured across the ceiling, stealing the air from her lungs. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of sleep. She scrambled for the door, but a wave of superheated air and smoke drove her back, her eyes streaming, her throat raw. The fire was moving with terrifying speed, cutting off her only escape. Just as despair began to claim her, the main door crashed inwards, ripped from its hinges. A figure stood silhouetted against the hellish glow, Silas. He had his coat pulled up over his mouth and nose, his eyes wild with a desperate urgency. "Eliza!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the roar. He didn't hesitate, plunging into the choking smoke. He found her on her knees, coughing, disoriented. He wrapped his coat around her, pulling her tight against his chest and turning his own back to the worst of the heat. "Hold on," he commanded, his arms like steel bands around her. He moved with a strength she never knew he possessed, shielding her with his body as he navigated the treacherous path back towards the door. A burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, narrowly missing them, showering them with a cascade of fiery sparks. One caught on his sleeve, and he beat it out without breaking stride. He burst back out into the freezing night air just as the roof of the cookhouse collapsed inwards with a deafening groan, sending a geyser of flame and smoke into the sky. He carried her a safe distance away before gently setting her down on the snow-covered ground. Men were shouting, running with buckets, their efforts futile against the raging inferno. Thaddeus stood like a statue, watching the building burn, his face an unreadable mask of grim resignation. But Silas saw none of it. He knelt before Eliza, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers with a raw, desperate intensity. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. She could only shake her head, her body trembling uncontrollably as she coughed, drawing in deep, ragged breaths of clean, cold air. Later, after the fire had been reduced to a smoldering, blackened skeleton, they found themselves in the quiet solitude of the main barn. Grizzly Sam had brought her a blanket and a mug of hot, sweetened coffee. The rest of the ranch was either asleep or gathered at the main house, leaving the two of them alone amongst the shadows and the soft sounds of restless livestock. The cookhouse was gone. Her job was gone. Her small, fragile sanctuary had been turned to ash. There was nothing left to hold her there. She looked at Silas, who was tending to a nasty burn on his forearm, his face stark and grim in the lantern light. The time for silence was over. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "Why did you do that, Silas?" He knew she wasn't just asking about the fire. She was asking about the firewood, the punch, the defiance to his father, everything. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the breath of a man who had been holding it in for years. He finally began to speak, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his confession. He told her everything. He told her his name was Silas Blackwood, not just Silas the hired hand. He told her about the night at the Rose Bell, how he had been there with friends, young and foolish and full of whiskey. He described in detail the spilled drinks, the rage of the merchant, a man named Thorne, and his own sickening, cowardly inaction as he watched her stand her ground with nothing but the fire in her eyes. "I've seen that moment every single day for 3 years, he confessed, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I watched them humiliate you, and I did nothing. I walked away, and I have never forgiven myself for it. When you walked out of the snow that first day, it was like a ghost had come back to hold me to account." Eliza listened, her expression unchanging, as he laid his soul bare. The pieces of the puzzle that was Silas Blackwood finally clicked into place. The silent protection, the explosive anger, the profound sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes, it was all born from this single moment of shame. "Thorne is the man who was here today," she stated, her voice flat. He nodded. "They were partners once, him and my father. They had a bitter falling out. Thorne lost everything. He's been buying up land around us for a year, trying to choke us out. I think he's trying to ruin my father, and you. You've just been caught in the middle of it." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading, raw with a vulnerability she had never seen in any man. "I'm so sorry, Eliza, for all of it." She set her mug down and, after a long moment, she reached out and gently touched the back of his hand, her fingers tracing the edge of the angry red burn on his arm. He flinched, not from pain, but from the unexpected contact. She didn't pull away. "You were a boy then, Silas," she said softly. "Tonight, you were a man." In that shared moment of honesty, in the quiet intimacy of the barn, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the ashes of the present, the walls between them finally crumbled. It wasn't pity she felt, but a profound, aching understanding. They were two broken people, scarred by the same man, haunted by the same night. From the ashes of the cookhouse, a vow was forged, silent but unbreakable. They would no longer be passive victims of Thorne's machinations. They would fight back. Together. Part 5. The Devil's Due. Sevens. The fragile alliance between Silas and Eliza transformed the cold barn into a clandestine command center. With Grizzly Sam as their trusted confidant, they began to piece together Thorne's strategy. Sam, with his long memory and network of old-timer friends, confirmed their suspicions. Thorne wasn't just buying land, he was damming streams and diverting water sources, preparing to strangle Stone River into submission. But Silas knew Thorne's hatred was too personal for a slow siege. He would want a final, humiliating victory. He suspected Thorne held some old debt or marker against his father, a legal weapon he was waiting for the perfect moment to deploy. While Silas rode to the county seat under the guise of buying supplies, secretly meeting with an old family lawyer to search the record books for any contracts bearing both the Blackwood and Thorne names, Eliza took on a different kind of fight. She refused to be a refugee. With a resilience that astounded the few men who were now firmly on her side, she established a makeshift kitchen in the bunkhouse, using borrowed pots and an open hearth to continue feeding the ranch hands. Her quiet determination was a more powerful statement than any shouted declaration. She was not a victim to be pitied, but a vital part of the ranch, and she would not be burned out. It was during this time that Thaddeus Blackwood, isolated by his own pride, watched the strange new dynamic unfold. He saw his son move with a newfound purpose, his quiet confidence replacing his old, haunted deference. He saw Eliza, the woman he had dismissed as a disgrace, command the respect of his men through sheer grit and unwavering service. For the first time, cracks began to appear in the old man's rigid certainty. Thorne made his move a week later, arriving not in a fancy buggy, but on horseback, flanked by the town's easily bought sheriff and Jed Grimes, who wore a smug, triumphant expression. They strode directly to the main house, where Thaddeus met them on the porch, his face a grim mask. "This is a private residence, Thorne," Thaddeus growled. Thorne simply smiled and produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "Merely collecting on an old debt, Blackwood," he said smoothly. "Do you recall a certain partnership agreement from 20 years ago? The one for that mining speculation that went bust? Your signature is right here, forfeiting your original stake in this very valley should you fail to repay your partner's investment. I, as you know, recently acquired all of your former partner's assets. The debt is due." Thaddeus's face went pale. It was a forgotten, foolish gamble from his youth, a skeleton he thought long buried. While the legal battle began on the porch, Jed Grimes saw his opportunity. He slipped away from the main group and headed for the bunkhouse, where he knew Eliza would be alone, preparing the evening meal. He entered silently, the open hearth casting a flickering, ominous light. Eliza turned, a sack of flour in her hands, her eyes widening in alarm. "Get out, Jed," she ordered, her voice low and steady. "I've got a better idea," he sneered, pulling a long-barreled pistol from his belt. "You and me are going to take a little walk. Seems Mr. Thorne needs some insurance to make sure this deal goes smoothly." Back at the house, Silas returned from his ride just in time to see the confrontation. He dismounted, his heart sinking as he saw the sheriff's badge. He had found it, a record of the old partnership, but also proof that Thorne's partner had declared bankruptcy years ago, likely nullifying any outstanding claims. But before he could present his findings, Grizzly Sam came running from the direction of the bunkhouse, his face panicked. "Silas!" "It's Eliza." Grimes took her. A cold dread washed over Silas, more terrifying than any fire. Thorne's plan was now brutally clear: legal pressure on his father, and violent leverage against him. Thorne chuckled, a low, cruel sound. "It seems your boy has a weakness, Blackwood. A weakness for damaged goods. Sign the deed, and the girl walks away unharmed. Refuse, and—" "Well, Mr. Grimes has a rather short temper." The world narrowed for Silas. He saw his father, stunned and defeated, looking 20 years older. He saw the smirking sheriff. He saw the face of the man who had haunted both his and Eliza's lives. In that moment, something inside him snapped. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear focus. He looked directly at Thorne. "You won't get this ranch," he said, his voice calm and deadly. Then he turned to his father. "Don't sign anything." Before anyone could react, he vaulted over the porch railing and sprinted towards the large, multi-level hay barn where he knew Jed would take her. Jed had indeed dragged Eliza into the cavernous barn, shoving her towards the rickety ladder leading to the hayloft. "Get up there," he commanded, prodding her with the pistol. "We're going to wait for the good news." Eliza's mind raced. She would not be a helpless pawn. As she climbed, she deliberately knocked a loose pulley hanging from a hay rope. It swung down, distracting Jed for a precious second. It was all she needed. As he looked up, she kicked out with all her might, her heavy boot catching him squarely in the chest. He staggered back with a cry of pain and rage, losing his footing on the hay-strewn floor. The pistol flew from his hand, skittering into the shadows. Just as Jed recovered, Silas burst through the barn doors. "Jed!" he roared. Jed, seeing his weapon was lost, abandoned Eliza and charged at Silas like a maddened bull. The two men crashed into each other, a whirlwind of fists and fury. It was a raw, brutal fight, not of skill, but of desperation. They slammed against wooden stalls, their grunts and the thud of their blows echoing in the huge space. Outside, witnessing his son's fearless charge, something broke in Thaddeus. The pride, the anger, it all melted away, replaced by a primal fear for his son and a profound shame for his own inaction. He looked Thorne dead in the eye. "My son is worth 10 of you," he snarled, and with a roar of his own, he lunged at the corrupt sheriff, his old rancher's strength surprising the complacent lawman. Inside the barn, Eliza was not idle. While Silas and Jed were locked in their struggle, she frantically searched for the fallen pistol. She spotted its metallic glint under a pile of loose hay. Just as Jed gained the upper hand, pinning Silas to the ground, his hands closing around Silas's throat, Eliza emerged from the shadows, the heavy pistol held steady in both hands. "Get off him! Jed!" she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. Jed froze, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared down the barrel of his own gun. That moment of hesitation was all Silas needed. He bucked upwards, throwing Jed off him. Silas scrambled to his feet, but Jed was quick, lunging for a nearby pitchfork. As he raised the wicked tines to strike, Eliza fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. She didn't hit Jed, she hadn't aimed to, but the bullet splintered the wooden handle of the pitchfork, sending shards of wood flying and making him drop it with a yelp of pain. At that moment, Thaddeus and Grizzly Sam, having subdued the sheriff, burst in. Jed, seeing he was outnumbered and unarmed, made a desperate run for the back exit, only to be met with a solid wall of loyal Stone River Cowboys who had rallied behind Sam. His fight was over. They dragged him out, trussed up like a calf for branding. Back at the house, Thorne stood alone and defeated, the fraudulent papers scattered at his feet. His leverage was gone, his muscle captured. Silas stood before him, breathing heavily, his face bruised, but his eyes clear. "It's over, Thorne." Thorne looked from Silas's determined face to Eliza, who stood by his side, no longer a victim, but a warrior. He saw Thaddeus, his old enemy, looking at his son with a pride he had never shown before. In that moment, Thorne knew he hadn't just lost a ranch, he had lost a war that had spanned decades. The devil had come for his due, but he had found the residents of Stone River unwilling to pay. Part 6. Eliza's Table. Sevens. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over Stone River Ranch, not with the clamor of victory, but with a profound, cleansing quiet. Bartholomew Thorne, stripped of his power and prestige, was handed over to the federal marshals, his web of deceit and fraudulent claims unraveling under the weight of his own hubris. Jed Grimes, sullen and defeated, was locked away, his petty cruelty finally caged. The corrupt sheriff was run out of the county, leaving a void that would soon be filled by a more honorable man. The poison had been excised, and in its place, the slow, steady process of healing began. The most significant healing, however, happened not in a courtroom, but on the front porch of the main house. One evening, as the setting sun painted the snow-capped peaks in hues of rose and gold, Thaddeus Blackwood approached Eliza. He stood before her, not as a patriarch or a ranch boss, but simply as an old man humbled by his own blindness. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "A man my age doesn't find it easy to admit when he's wrong. I judged you. I judged my own son. I was a proud old fool, and it nearly cost me everything." He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. "What you did. The courage you showed. You have more honor than a dozen men like Thorne. This ranch, this family, owes you a debt." Eliza simply nodded, accepting the apology with the same quiet grace with which she had endured the insults. Later that evening, Thaddeus and Silas stood together by the fire, the long, cold silence between them finally broken. Thaddeus placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "I was wrong about you, son," he said, the words a monumental admission. "I always saw the quiet boy, not the man you'd become. This ranch needs a leader with a strong arm, but a stronger heart. It needs you." The torch had been passed. The seasons turned, and the harsh winter finally loosened its grip, giving way to a vibrant Montana spring. The snow melted, feeding the creeks and turning the vast plains into a sea of green grass and wildflowers. The ranch, under Silas's thoughtful leadership and Thaddeus's wise counsel, began to thrive as never before. Silas managed the men not with his father's gruff commands, but with a quiet, earned respect, listening to their concerns and working alongside them. But the most significant change at Stone River was not in the fields or with the cattle. It was a small, beautiful building constructed from new pine, standing where the old cookhouse had been reduced to ash. A hand-carved sign swung gently in the breeze above the wide, welcoming porch, bearing two simple words: Eliza's Table. It was more than a new kitchen. It was the physical manifestation of a dream. Inside, the space was filled with light and the scent of baking bread, cinnamon, and roasting meat. Long wooden tables were filled not just with ranch hands, but with travelers from the main trail and families from the nearby town. Eliza was no longer just a cook. She was a proprietress, the heart and soul of the most beloved eatery in the territory. Her mother's leather-bound cookbook, its pages now worn with use, lay open on a special shelf, its recipes no longer just memories, but the foundation of her new life. She moved through the room with an easy confidence, her laughter now frequent and genuine. She hired 2 young women from the town, teaching them not just how to cook, but how to save their money and build a future of their own. She had created the sanctuary she had always longed for, not just for herself, but for others. Silas was never far away. When not working the ranch, he could often be found at her establishment, not as a customer, but as a partner. He would be in the back, mending a broken chair, tending to the small herb garden he had planted for her just outside the kitchen window, or simply sitting at a corner table, watching her with a look of quiet adoration. The silence that had once defined their relationship had been replaced by a comfortable, easy intimacy, a language of shared glances, knowing smiles, and gentle touches that spoke more than words ever could. One warm summer afternoon, a year after the fire, they stood together on a hill overlooking the ranch. The valley below was a patchwork of vibrant life, the grazing cattle, the bustling activity of the yard, and the warm, inviting light spilling from the windows of Eliza's table. The scars of the past remained, the burn on Silas's arm, the memories in Eliza's eyes, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were reminders of a battle fought and won, of a love forged in adversity and tempered by forgiveness. "Do you ever think of him?" Silas asked quietly, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "Thorn?" she mused, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Sometimes. I remember the fear, but then I remember the sight of you bursting through that door, and the fear just fades." She turned to face him, her hand coming up to gently touch the weathered skin of his cheek. "He took nothing from me that mattered. You gave me everything that does." He smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached his eyes. "You built this, Eliza. All of it. I just held the ladder." "We held it for each other," she corrected softly. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss not of desperate passion, but of deep, abiding peace. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of quiet evenings, of a life built not on the shifting sands of the past, but on the solid rock of mutual respect and love. They had faced down their demons, both internal and external, and had emerged into the sunlight, whole and together. They had no need to run from the past anymore, for they had built a future so bright it cast no shadows. And as they stood there, hand in hand, looking out at the land that was their home, they knew that this was not the end of their story. It was the true beginning of everything. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the biting winds of judgment, the flames of a bitter past, and the quiet, resilient warmth of a love determined to survive. The story of Eliza Vance and Silas Blackwood is a powerful testament to the enduring human spirit. It begins with two souls lost in the wilderness of their own making, a woman defined by a past she did not choose, and a man imprisoned by a single moment of cowardice. Together, they face down not only the cruel whispers of society and the calculated villainy of a man like Bartholomew Thorne, but also the formidable walls of family pride and personal shame. Their story teaches us a profound lesson of the West. Your true character is not forged in the victories you are given, but in the battles you choose to fight after you have fallen. It reminds us that redemption is not a gift, but a choice, a daily act of courage. And that true love is not about finding someone without scars, but about having the strength to cherish the person who helps you heal your own. Their journey from the ashes of a burned-down cookhouse to the welcoming warmth of Eliza's table is a story for anyone who has ever dreamed of a second chance. If this tale of courage, forgiveness, and frontier love resonated with your heart, please help us share it. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a story with soul, and be sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and ring the bell for more unforgettable tales. What was your favorite moment in Eliza and Silas's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, ride safe and never let the ghosts of the past dictate the trail ahead.